Okay, welcome. Today, my presentation, as you can see, the places of law in a self-employed person's well-being at work. We'll walk you through a series of images. These are the visual renderings of my PhD as viewed from my place. On a Lacanian psychoanalysis, well-being is the place internal to the individual, but sometimes that place is worn externally on her sleeve. In this research, I am adopting the theorisation of law as plural material. That theorisation is from Margaret Davies from 2017, which does not view law as static or reified in a series of legal texts, but rather as material, as it is performed and rendered visible in the experiential world. The setting of the research is a locale of study of the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales. This region boasts rates of entrepreneur and solopreneurs 2 to 3 times the national average. The subjects of the research are self-employed persons themselves, but also the omnipresent reasonable person, that shadowy figure in law who follows us around in objective readings of what we ought to do. The target of this law is rendered visible through a series of lenses. Those lenses refract the formal law through a variety of normative ways other than what is written in the law itself. This research hopes to hold up those lenses in order to render what law is in the material world visible. The theoretical framework is borrowed from Davies and views law as both a black and white sketch, but also those real things out there. Law in this way is seen as a collection of Parliament's intention, but also a glass print representing the transparency of what the self-employed person actually does for herself in the real. But also there's a film negative, as some self-employed persons, and quite aptly roughly half of my participants, hate law. They view law as something that simply does not belong in their well-being. But what is law's lack? Or more aptly, what is the lack in the world that law hopes to suppress? That's a question of statutory interpretation, which harks back to the year 1584 in Hayden's case, which says that in interpreting the meaning of words in a statute, we have to figure out what was wrong in the world. According to the Parliament, that's the prevalence of workplace injury, illness, and death. But what this law fails to recognise, but also hopes silently to achieve, is the idea of a self-employed person herself reaching to it as a means of not only her survival, but her ability to thrive in the world at work. The research found 3 significant findings. The first is the idea of liability. And if you look closely, and it may be hard to see, pierced on the line coming out from the pandemistry are 2 rays of light. Those rays are pierced in the red, an outer layer of liability that is forcibly cloaked around each self-employed person herself. That liability is to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, his or her own health and safety while at work, under Section 19.5 of the Work Health and Safety Act. I might mention that the Act, of course, is in New South Wales because of the locale in the Northern Rivers region, but also the fact that model work health and safety law has been enacted in all Australian jurisdictions but for Victoria. That layer of liability is seen from the outside in by way of Section 12A of the Act, which says that the self-employed person has absolute liability. Whether or not she knows of this law or has any intentions or recklessness to the contrary is not an issue. Sandra says that there is no distinction between health and well-being. And when we view law from a series of statutory interpretive rules, we can start to see some case law which supports Sandra's ideas. That is, that health is well-being. So therefore, well-being enters the domain of the legal through the signifier health. And the eudaimonic staircase of setting goals is one way to well-being in the literature. Ruth, a little differently, does not always achieve her goals, but her views of the physical workplace are supported by the signifier health in the act. Sorry, welfare in the act. Welfare in case law has been interpreted to mean well-being, not only in the context of family law, but law more generally. And there are examples of physical hazards, but also psychosocial hazards, which are creeping into law's recognition as being worthy of the self-employed person's liability. But beyond that liability, there's an inner slip of intention, that orange aspect of the lens, which is hidden just beyond the liability. New South Wales Parliament intends the law to cover not only the health and safety, but the welfare of its legal subjects. However, liability for their welfare is not there in the Act beyond the provision of adequate facilities for their welfare at work. And that would be the physical work environment, such as what Ruth suggested. On this view, that inner slip of intention can be worn when we see things like Jonas's actions. Here we have a harrowing example of congruent risk management. That is, that hazards can pose risks not only to health and safety, but well-being. And in this contingent instance, Jonas's only action was to not work during that period of time. Jenny exercises another view of law in action, which is that of promoting well-being. Jenny might be the perfect legal subject in the study as a health and well-being coach herself. And these, perhaps cliched, perhaps not, things that she does are actually promoting her well-being. And there's a view in the literature proffered by Michael Toomer in March 2020, quite a coincidental time, which suggests that promoting well-being is actually protective as risk management. That is, if we promote conditions for ourselves of health, of well-being rather, of mindfulness, exercise, nutrition, which Megan Lee will talk about later, and sleep, they are the ways for work health and safety. The third finding in the study is a little more esoteric, which is of legal consciousness. Legal consciousness is a theory developed by Uwick and Silby in 1906, which stated that legal consciousness is a meeting of the minds, per se, between the Parliament's intention and the legal subject. And you can see here two images. The first is of an actual eclipse. The second is of a near eclipse, approximately 26 minutes before the eclipse occurred. The eclipse is significant because in psychoanalysis, Maria Aristodomou says that in those contingent instances where the signifier has fitted the signified, that is where there is an eclipse of what we mean inside and our ability to speak it, there is the ability of well-being. And in this respect, the research finds that eclipse through the idea of legal self-regulation. In 1972, the Robins Committee heralded this idea where they recognised the autonomy of the self-employed person. Here, Terry, a self-employed environmental assessor, is storing an experience where he almost died, but he's also storing the need for law to protect him because of a lack in the law which applies to him. And ironically, he's looking to law beyond the text of the Act in order to cover his well-being. Whereas Ebony suggests the exact opposite. Ebony has a desire for self-regulation and points particularly to the neoliberal subject of the self-employed person exercising autonomy. Autonomy is indeed one idea of well-being proposed by Schulte and others in 2012, and it is something that the very design of the Act fits. To have a lack of the signifier well-being in the text of the Act is to open it to various interpretations, but also various desires of legal subjects. And whether or not those desires, broadly construed, are for the legal or self-regulation of her own well-being, the Act covers it. So the research culminates in a metasage, the idea of an interweaving of relations produced in narrative form as a collage hung on the line, yes, but that narrative form is the vehicle or the performative act through which the material law is produced in the research. In conclusion, I am performing the act of sending that message out to the world for the reader's interpretations. And this is very fitting because in May 2021, the work health and safety ministers from around the country, but for Victoria, convened and discussed the idea about whether work health and safety law is still fit for purpose and about whether any amendments are needed for psychological health, particularly in light of COVID accentuating risks to psychological health. However, the research perhaps serves as a warning against including the signifier well-being in the text of a law because of the old maxim that to define a right is to limit it. The research argues that the fit-for-purpose design of open-endedness enables a way to well-being as autonomy. Marty's addition to the research perhaps serves as a coda. It's the idea that we need legal education, and thus the research in its form performs that act of sending that letter. But the form of it is postcards because the postcards are emblematic of the places of law and well-being which the research finds. So the research serves as a pathway, which Davies suggests is a useful metaphor for considering contemporary ideas of law, for further researchers to consider these ideas, particularly when topics straddle the periphery of law in its text, but also its intended targets. The research finds that there is a place of law in well-being, but only when that place itself is deeply respectful of the plural places of well-being within us. And thus the research forms an intersubjective space between the law and each legal subject, and analogously between me and each of my readers. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you.
Nice to see you again.
You too.
If anybody has any questions for Emma, if you might just raise your hands perhaps, and we could field a few questions before the next presentation. Shay?
Is it currently something that's being discussed and contested about work health and safety law generally?
That's an excellent question, Shay. The short answer is no, because the way that work health and safety law is contested in the cases is very black and white because of that absolute liability nature of offences. So in order for the work health and safety regulator, which in New South Wales is Safe Work New South Wales, or up here Safe Work Queensland, to actually prosecute anybody, let alone a self-employed person, their actions need to fall below those of the reasonable person. But because the reasonable person isn't required to do anything for their well-being in law's letter, there are literally 0 cases which test this idea. There are, however, 19 or so cases which include section 19 and the word well-being, but the link is very tenuous and it's very coming from what people say in the cases. It's almost like a slip. It's not really the core material issue.
Yeah, so can I ask another question? So does it sounds like it's possible for somebody to be prosecuted for slipping over and hurting themselves at their own workplace?
It is.
If they're self-employed, it seems a bit ironic.
It is, Shay, and it's very funny because the knowledge of this law is definitely lacking, and also its prosecution is. And so this is one area of law where the self-employed person herself is often forgotten, not only in the prosecutions, but also in the commentary. But it's important because self-employed persons out there are the ones suffering the most, arguably, with their well-being and small business failure and closure. And so the idea was whether or not law could bridge a gap between the practical reality and not.
And encourage people to actually look after themselves.
Yes, yes. And that was the altruistic intention initially, but it was a bit paternalistic.
Thank you.
Emma, we just had another question from a lady in the row back. Yes, yes.
I was just curious a little bit about your study and the population that you interviewed.
Beg your pardon?
Oh, sorry, I was just curious about your study, like your the people you interviewed, like the population.
Oh, sure. So the recruitment criteria was that you had to be a self-employed person in small business in the Northern Rivers region. I interviewed 29 people who fit that criteria and conducted a thematic analysis and also a structural analysis and crafted a vignette from each of their transcripts.
And could they have any profession?
Yes.
Just one question. Beautiful study, Emma.
Thank you.
Lovely piece of work, but of course I'm going to ask you this question. Can you tell us a little bit more about the visual presence in your study, the beautiful photographs? Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely, Lexi. Thank you. The visual presence came from the idea of visual narrative analysis and the idea of found images. And in the thesis, I don't reveal that I actually took those images until making an apologia at the very end. And that's where I reveal my own positionality as part of the research itself, because, and to quote your work, the research became very much walking through the research. And as I found that in the experiential world, quite literally walking through the world. Thank you.
Emma. Very beautiful. I think we might have to stop that there. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you.